In this episode of How Samples Fake Us Out, we pit a real trombonist against a sampled trombone to see who can hold a note the longest, without passing out. On your right, Steve, trombonist. On your left, the contender, an east-west solo trombone, sustain articulation. Steve's audio is in the right speaker, the east-west sound is in the left. Who shall emerge victorious? Let's find out. Gentlemen, start your trombones. Well, that didn't take very long. The east-west trombone gave up in just 9 seconds, and meanwhile, Steve is still going. We'll check back with Steve in a minute to see how he's holding up. In the meantime, let's examine another trombone sound, this being a Vienna Instruments solo trombone sustain articulation. And do you hear that repeating sound? Now, if Steve was competing with this one, I'd have to stop the proceedings and disqualify the contender from Vienna, because that sound you're hearing is a telltale sign that the sample is looping. And in the context of this contest, that's like totally cheating, because of course a looped sound can sustain forever, and even a guy like Steve can't hold a note forever. Maybe he can. Okay, Steve, we'll check up on you again in a little while, see how you're doing. Okay. Of course, the upside to looped samples is that we can make notes sustain for as long as we need them to, and we can conclude them when we need to, as compared with the east-west trombone sample, which concludes when the musician who was sampled ended the note. Now, a 9-second long trombone sample might be just fine for expressing a long trombone note if your tempo was, say, 130 beats per minute. So that was long enough to sustain for 4 measures. But if you needed a 4-measure trombone note at 90 beats per minute, well, you might just run out of trombone. I have the funny feeling, though, that if we had Steve on that session instead of a sample, we wouldn't have to worry about running out of trombone. Isn't that right, Steve? Oh, you know how many times he's told me not to interrupt him while he's working? I never learn. Okay, so what do we do if we're working at a slow tempo and we need to write a long sustaining note or a long melodic line where a real player would run out of breath? So what do? Well, we can use the same technique that orchestrators use, and that's called dovetailing. Now, dovetailing can mean 2 different things in orchestral writing, but here I'm referring to the technique where a second player takes over the part from the first player as they run out of breath. It's actually a form of crossfading between 2 instruments. And to demonstrate this, here's a dovetailed flute part playing a very long C, where flute 1 is an east-west sustained flute that doesn't loop, and flute 2 is a Vienna Special Edition flute that does loop. Now, at this tempo of 120 BPM, the east-west sample will hold for a little longer than 4 measures before it naturally concludes. So I have the Vienna flute making its entrance about 2 beats before the east-west flute runs out. And then it repeats 1 time. Now perhaps you're wondering, why did I go through all that trouble to create a long C note? Why couldn't I just use the looped Vienna flute and call it a day? Well, here's why. If I had just used the looped flute, the looping would set up a rhythmic pattern after a while, and it would sound obvious that it's a looped sample and therefore sound fake. And that's just way too annoying. The second thing is that the transition from the tone and character of the East-West flute into the Vienna flute and then back and forth creates a little bit of a textural change, which you would expect to hear if two real players were dovetailing. Oh my God, I almost forgot to check on Steve. Yeek, his eyes are like just about to roll up in his head. Oh, no, he's okay, he's okay. He's just feeling a little slow motion-y right now. Now, not to take anything away from Steve, but he really didn't hold that note for 4 minutes. It's through the magic of video editing that I made him appear like the trombone hero that he is in real life. He actually did hold that note for nearly half a minute, which is 3 times longer than the East-West sample recorded at the same dynamic. So this begs the question, can we use the length of unlooped notes as they appear in sampler instruments to accurately judge how long a real player can hold the note? And the answer here is no. There are all kinds of reasons why a sample developer will choose to loop a sample or not, or ask a trombone player on a sampling session to hold a note for only 9 seconds instead of a possible 30. But one thing you should keep in mind when mocking up parts that will eventually be written for real players to perform is that there's a tremendous amount of variation in how long a player can hold a note, and it will vary based on the register, the dynamic level they're asked to play at, and of course the particular instrument that they play. The best way to learn about the specifics for each instrument is to listen to recordings and study scores and perhaps get a good book or two on orchestration. Or, short of doing that stuff, you can try this technique. As you're writing woodwind and brass parts, try humming along with the part, or just breathe along with the part, sort of pretending like you're blowing through a woodwind or brass instrument. And if you find yourself running out of breath, well, make sure your virtual instruments take a breath too, or consider using the dovetailing technique.